when the darkness reveals the truth. A crime uncovered. Hook. Imagine being trapped in a room with shadows that move on their own, whispers you can't escape, and a presence that knows your every fear. What happens when the darkness finally comes for you? Stay till the end to uncover the chilling truth, if you dare. The wind howled through the cracked windows. The walls seemed to groan with every gust. A shadow shifted near the far corner. Her breath quickened. She didn't move. The air smelled thick, like something burning. Her eyes darted to the door. Locked. But she knew. She could feel it. Someone was in the room with her. The floor creaked under the weight of something, or someone. Her heart hammered in her chest. She stayed still, frozen. A faint sound came from behind her. A footstep, soft but unmistakable. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. The figure was getting closer, closer. Then silence. Complete silence. Not even the wind dared to speak. Her skin prickled, her breath shallow. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears. The seconds stretched on forever. The floor creaked again, louder this time. She didn't dare look. The air shifted, cold, colder. Her body shuddered. A whisper, barely audible. Don't turn around. Her stomach twisted into knots. Her mind screamed to run, but her body refused. The figure was inches away now. She could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. Her muscles screamed for movement, but her feet stayed planted. The whisper came again. Don't move. Suddenly, the door slammed open. Light poured in from the hallway. The figure didn't flinch. It stayed in place. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation. Her legs trembled, but still, she didn't move. Then a voice she recognized. You're not alone here, she gasped, spinning around. The room was empty, but the air still felt heavy. And she wasn't alone anymore. The silence was deafening. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned back to the door. Nothing. No one. But something wasn't right. The shadows in the room seemed deeper now. They stretched, crawling along the walls. Her skin tingled. Her heart pounded. The light from the hallway flickered. Once, twice. Then it went out. Complete darkness. Her pulse raced. She reached for her phone, hands trembling. No signal. She cursed under her breath. A sudden shift in the air. Behind her. Too close. A voice, soft as a breath. You're not leaving this place. The room grew colder, the kind of cold that sank into your bones. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. Her eyes scanned the darkness. Nothing. She was alone, yet she wasn't. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She spun around. Nothing there. Her body froze. The sound of breathing, harsh and uneven, filled the room. It wasn't hers. She pressed herself against the wall. The sound grew louder, closer. The air was so thick now she could almost taste it. Every breath felt like it was getting harder to take. A slow, creeping panic began to rise. Then, a sudden noise, a scraping. It came from the far end of the room, metal against metal, dragging closer. She forced her eyes to stay open. Her vision blurred in the dark. The sound came closer, closer still. Then the scraping stopped. Dead silence. And then she felt it. A hand on her shoulder, her body went rigid. The touch was ice cold. It sent a shock of fear straight through her spine. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The hand lingered for a moment. Then it slowly slid down her arm. She could feel the nails, sharp, jagged, scraping against her skin. Her heart raced. She turned her head, just slightly, but there was nothing there. No one. Her mind spun, her thoughts a blur. Was she losing her grip on reality? She swallowed hard, a thick lump in her throat. A sound, then a low laugh. It came from somewhere behind her. So close, yet there was no one. Her vision flickered, like something was distorting it. The shadows around her began to move, shifting, twisting. "Who's there?" Her voice trembled. It was barely a whisper. Another laugh, faint but unmistakable. It felt like it was right next to her ear. Her blood ran cold. She was not alone. The shadows on the walls stretched toward her, long fingers of darkness reaching out. Suddenly, the room seemed to close in, the walls pressing in tighter. She gasped for air, but it felt thick, suffocating. Her chest ached. Then, the whisper came again, more insistent this time. "You shouldn't have stayed." Her heart pounded harder. Her body screamed for her to run, but her legs were frozen. The shadows in the room seemed to breathe. They were alive, and they were closing in on her. The walls groaned again. The air was thick with a presence she couldn't see, but she could feel. Her mind raced. What was happening? Then she saw it. A flash. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the darkness, barely visible. And in that moment she knew. It was watching her. The figure moved, slowly, looming, its shape twisted in the dim light. But its face, no, there was no face. Just an empty void. She could feel its gaze on her. Heavy, dark. Her legs trembled. She could barely stand. The air seemed to vibrate around her. The very room seemed alive with tension. It stepped forward, each movement deliberate, calculated. Her breath hitched. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry. The figure was closer now, a shadow of nightmares, its presence suffocating. She felt a chill creeping along her spine. It reached out, a hand, long and twisted, extending toward her. Her mind screamed for her to move, but her body wouldn't obey. The hand hovered near her face. It smelled like dust, like decay. She flinched, but the hand didn't touch her. It was just there, inches from her skin. Then it moved, fingers brushing her cheek. Cold, unfeeling. The room was spinning, her vision blurring. The whisper came again, a rasping hiss. "Don't try to escape." The darkness seemed to pulse. It was everywhere now, closing in. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her chest tightened, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The figure took a step back, just one, and in that single movement, everything changed. The shadows lunged. She could feel them wrapping around her, like tendrils of some twisted, dark force. The walls seemed to close in even more, the air thick with dread. And then, nothing. A sudden, deafening silence. The figure was gone. The shadows vanished. The room, empty once more. But she wasn't alone. Not anymore. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps. She stood there, trembling. The room felt too still, too quiet. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything. But there was nothing, just emptiness. Then she heard it, a faint whisper. It was too close. She spun around, her heart thundering. Nothing. But the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. "You can't escape." The voice was cold. It sent a shiver deep into her bones. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air growing heavier. She backed away, her legs weak, her mind spinning. The whisper came again, sharper. "You're ours now." She stumbled, her breath quickening. Her skin prickled. Something was wrong. The shadows on the walls flickered, alive again. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy. A sudden, sharp crack split the silence. A light bulb overhead exploded, sending shards of glass to the floor. She gasped, heart racing. Her hand shot to her throat. The shadows twisted. They moved faster now, growing thicker. The temperature dropped. Her breath turned to mist. She turned, desperate to find an escape. But the door was gone. The walls were moving, changing, shifting. The darkness swirled, a storm of blackness. And then, out of the void, a shape, emerging slowly, deliberately. It had no form, no clear outline, just a presence, a force. Her legs gave out beneath her. She sank to the floor, unable to move. It loomed over her, the air around it crackling. And then, the voice. So close now, a breath in her ear. You should have left. The darkness closed in. Her vision blurred. Everything went black. The darkness pressed in on her, suffocating. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Her body felt heavy, paralyzed. But she was still aware, still awake. The whispers echoed around her, unheard by anyone but her. You belong here now. The voice was low, smooth like a serpent's hiss. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced. There was something wrong. A shift in the air. A sudden coldness that froze her to the core. Her limbs refused to obey. She couldn't move, couldn't escape. And then she felt it. Something crawling along her skin. It was like fingers, cold, wet. No, it was something worse. A presence, not quite solid. A thing that shouldn't be real. Her eyes flickered open, straining against the pitch-black void. And there, something moved. Shapes like smoke, swirling around her. They were everywhere. Her breath came faster now. Short, panicked gasps. Then a figure appeared, emerging from the shadows. Its shape was unclear. A mass of shifting darkness. A silhouette against the nothingness. It moved closer, closer. It felt as if the very air around her was closing in, squeezing the life from her. The figure loomed above her, a dark shape without features, no face, but she could feel its eyes, burning, staring, watching. You should have left, the voice said again. It was almost familiar. Her mind spun, a memory distant buried. She gasped. Her hand shot out in a desperate attempt to push the shadow away, but her fingers met nothing. The dark figure seemed to smile. It wasn't a smile. It was worse. It was a shift in the shape, a horrible stretching of something that shouldn't be. Then, suddenly, a force, like a blast of wind, shoved her back. She slammed against the floor. Her breath came in jagged gasps. Her body trembled uncontrollably. And then, in the blink of an eye, the shadows were gone. The figure vanished, leaving her in an empty room once again. But she was not alone. She could feel it, the eyes on her. They were still there. Waiting, her skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. The silence was suffocating. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for any movement, but there was nothing. Stillness. Yet, the air felt charged, like a storm about to break. She tried to rise, but her body wouldn't obey. Her limbs were stiff. The weight of the darkness pressed down on her chest. It was harder to breathe now. The cold was unbearable, a chill that gnawed at her bones. Then, a sound, a faint scrape. It came from behind her. She froze. The scrape grew louder, closer. She turned her head slowly, eyes wide, heart racing. There, a shadow, lurking at the edge of her vision. It shifted, moved. Her breath caught in her throat. The darkness seemed to stir, eager, alive. It crept forward, closer to her. Something stirred inside her chest, a feeling she couldn't explain, like her very soul was being tugged. The scraping sound stopped, a silence, thick and unbearable, and then a whisper. You cannot run. It was almost gentle, like a caress against her skin, but it was a lie. She could run. She had to. Her legs finally gave way. She pushed herself up, fighting against the paralysis that still held her. Her breath was ragged, her hands shaking. She staggered to the door, but it was gone. There was no escape. A scream tore from her throat. The walls seemed to close in, tighter. The shadows, they were everywhere now, filling the space with darkness. The air grew thick with dread. It was suffocating. And then she saw it again. The figure. It was there, standing in front of her. Its form shifting. No face. No features. Just an endless void. A hollow presence. "You are ours now," the voice whispered again. This time louder. Closer. Her body trembled. And then she felt something wrap around her ankle. Cold fingers. Tight. Her scream echoed in the emptiness. The darkness swallowed her whole. The cold fingers tightened around her ankle, pulling her down. She kicked, struggled, but the grip was relentless. Her heart hammered in her chest, panic clawing at her throat. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The darkness around her thickened, a suffocating weight pressing on her chest. She clawed at the floor, desperate to free herself. But the shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They had weight. They had form. They dragged her further, closer to the center of the room. Her body fought, fighting the pull, fighting the inevitable. The walls, they were closing in again. The space shrinking. Her mind screamed, but her body refused to obey. Then the voice, louder now, unyielding. "You cannot escape us." It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a roar, an oppressive sound that shook the air around her. The shadows wrapped around her, tighter, until she could barely move. Her body felt cold, frozen, like something had seeped into her bones and was slowly erasing her. The light that flickered in the hallway earlier, it was gone now. All she could see was the void, an endless black abyss that swallowed everything. She heard the scraping again, the same noise, closer. It was behind her now, in her ear, a low, dragging sound, a promise of something worse. Her eyes fluttered open. The figure was there, right in front of her. This time it didn't move. It didn't need to. The hollow presence pressed down on her, like it was feeding, drawing the life out of her. She could feel her mind slipping, like the edges were dissolving. But there was one thought, one clear thought that pierced through the fog. "I'm still here." And then the grip on her ankle loosened. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Her body remained frozen, suspended between fear and nothingness. Then the darkness began to pull away, not completely, but just enough for her to breathe, just enough for her to see. The door. It was there, right in front of her, her breath caught in her throat. The door. It was real, but it was still so far away. She didn't hesitate. She pushed herself forward, shoving against the weight of the shadows that clung to her skin. Each movement was a battle. Her legs shook. Her body felt like it was made of lead. The door was so close now. Her hand reached out, fingers trembling. The shadows scraped at her skin, tugging at her, fighting to keep her there. Her fingers brushed the door handle. It was cold, too cold. She gripped it tightly, turning it with all the strength she had left. The door creaked open, but a force slammed against her, pushing her back. She gasped, falling to the floor. The shadows rose again, swarming over her like a tide of darkness. She looked up. The figure was standing there, watching her. Its presence was overwhelming. It filled the room, filled her mind, a weight that she could not escape. "You cannot leave," it whispered. The voice was a cold, familiar hiss. Her vision blurred. She had no strength left to fight. The shadows pressed in on her chest. She couldn't breathe. Her body felt numb. and the darkness seemed to swallow her whole. But before she slipped into nothingness, she saw it, a faint light, a flicker at the edge of her vision. It was outside the door. Her eyes widened. She forced her legs to move, pushing herself toward the door once more. With every ounce of willpower she had, she pulled herself to her feet. The door was right there, just inches away. She reached for it again. This time, the handle turned easily. The door swung open, and there, standing in the light, a figure. It was familiar. Her breath caught. It was someone she knew. The figure stood in the doorway, bathed in pale light. Her heart raced, her mind struggling to process. It was him, the person she had been searching for. She stumbled forward, reaching out with trembling hands. But something was wrong. His face. It was too still, too empty. She froze. His eyes were hollow, void of recognition, void of life. "Come," the figure said, its voice flat, lifeless. The words hung in the air, but they didn't sound like him. It couldn't be him. Not like this. She took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. And then, the figure's mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. Not a smile. A stretch of darkness. A blackness that swallowed the light. A twisted grin that grew unnaturally wide. Her pulse quickened. Something was wrong. The door slammed shut behind her. The room plunged back into suffocating darkness. She spun around, trying to find another way out, but there was no door, no exit, just walls closing in. The figure stepped closer. "I told you," it whispered. "You can't leave." The voice wasn't his. It was something deeper, something darker. Her mind screamed for her to wake up, to escape. But this was real. This was the nightmare. She backed away, heart racing, but there was no place to run. The figure reached out, its hands long, shadowed, stretching unnaturally toward her. She could feel its coldness, its presence surrounding her, drawing her in. Then a voice, her own voice. But it wasn't her. It echoed in her head, a whispered plea. "Don't turn around." Her body froze. Her eyes were locked on the figure. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The darkness was suffocating. And then everything went silent. Except for the sound of her own heartbeat. Her heart pounded in her chest, a deafening thud that drowned out everything else. The silence was unbearable. The figure was still, but she could feel its presence, like it was closing in on her. She couldn't tear her eyes away. It felt like it was pulling her closer, drawing her into that dark void. She tried to move, to run, but her legs were frozen. Every inch of her screamed to escape, but her body wouldn't obey. The figure didn't speak again, but its eyes, empty, hollow, stared at her with an intensity that made her feel small. The cold in the room intensified, a biting chill that made her teeth rattle. It felt like she was being submerged in ice. And then the air shifted. The shadows around her thickened, moving like liquid smoke, curling around her legs, her waist. The whispers came again, closer. "Welcome home." The words were so soft, so gentle, but they felt like daggers in her mind. A wave of dizziness hit her. Her knees buckled. She sank to the floor, but the shadows kept pulling her, dragging her down into the cold, dark earth. Her fingers clawed at the floor, trying to hold on, trying to fight. But the more she resisted, the tighter they gripped. It was like she was sinking into the very fabric of the darkness. The air became thick, heavy, as if the room itself was alive, breathing in time with her own shallow gasps. And then a voice, soft and terrible, whispered once more, "You are ours." She looked up, her vision blurring. The figure's form began to twist, meld with the shadows. It was no longer human, no longer anything. It was pure, suffocating darkness. And as she felt herself being pulled further, her mind screamed one last time, desperate for escape, for freedom. But the darkness was too strong. It consumed her, and then there was nothing. The silence was deafening. For a moment, she felt weightless, suspended in a void. Her limbs felt numb, like they weren't her own. There was no sound, no movement, just darkness. She couldn't tell if her eyes were open. The blackness was all-consuming. But then, a flicker, a tiny spark of light. It appeared at the edge of her vision, a dim glow, like a candle's flame struggling to stay alive. She gasped, her mind grasping for the sensation of life, of air, of warmth. The light grew stronger, closer. She took a tentative step, then another, her body slowly coming back to life, responding to the pull of the light. It was real. She could feel it, the warmth, the comfort, the promise of escape. Her feet barely touched the ground as she walked, guided by the light, her steps moving faster. The shadows behind her began to retreat, the oppressive weight lifting as the glow grew stronger. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the light. It was warm. A sudden rush of air filled her lungs, and the world around her shifted. She blinked. The darkness was gone. The air smelled fresh, the light blinding and pure. She stumbled forward into the warmth of the light, her body shaking as the weight of the terror began to lift. She stood there, breathing deeply, reveling in the sensation of life returning to her. And then she heard it, the faintest whisper, "Not yet." She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The world began to twist. The light started to fade. The shadows were creeping back. A deep, bone-chilling cold returned. The warmth of the light flickered once more, then went out. And in that moment, she knew it was never meant to be. The shadows surrounded her again, filling the space. This time, she didn't run. There was no escape. The darkness claimed her. The darkness lingered, but it no longer felt suffocating. The cold that had once clawed at her skin seemed to fade, and the weight pressing on her chest grew lighter. She stood there in the quiet, the shadows surrounding her, but no longer threatening. Her breath slowed, her pulse calming. In the distance, the faintest shimmer of light caught her eye. Soft, steady, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the night. She stepped toward it, slowly, tentatively, as if her body knew the journey was coming to an end. The darkness shifted behind her, but it didn't follow. It simply watched. The light grew, brighter now, until it bathed her in warmth. It wasn't a harsh, blinding light. It was gentle, comforting, as if it had been waiting for her all along. She reached out, her hand trembling, and as her fingers brushed against the soft glow, a wave of peace washed over her. It was like coming home. The shadows receded, their presence no longer a threat. She felt herself being lifted, not physically, but spiritually. The light embraced her. It felt like freedom, like a long-awaited release. Her heart, which had been pounding in fear, now felt steady, content. And in that final moment, as she stood in the light, she realized something. It wasn't about escaping the darkness. It wasn't about running away. It was about accepting it, letting it go, and moving forward. The light, soft and serene, began to fade. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She was at peace. Her body no longer trembled. Her mind no longer raced. She had found what she was meant to find, not in the escape, but in the quiet acceptance of what had happened. And with that, the darkness disappeared, leaving nothing but the calm of a new beginning.